Daily Wire co-CEO went full mask off during a recent discussion where they talked about the 3/5 compromise. Take a look.
The 3/5 compromise is one of the better kind of concepts that the founders came up with to long-term end slavery in America. They didn't say a black person is 3/5 of a human. They said, you know, it doesn't make sense, slave owners in the South, that you're going to count your unrepresented, unable to vote, and unable to function in everyday life slave population in your census for the purpose of representation in the Congress. Maybe you can't count them. And the South, particularly South Carolina, essentially said they wouldn't join the union if they didn't get to count them. And so the compromise was they don't get to count all the way so that you don't get to use
an enslaved population
to gain votes.
That's an important academic point. It's true, but it's also like we should just be able to respond. Well, that makes no difference right now. That has no bearing on modern America.
Oh, really? Okay, so I love how it's like, oh, you know, they did it this way so that they couldn't use an enslaved population to gain votes. But that's exactly what they did. That was the whole point of allowing them to do 3/5. Okay, yeah, we'll let you into the union, and in, you know, in return for you staying and joining the union, we're going to allow you to at least count 60% of your slave population. And that's what that is. So that you get more representation in Congress, even though the people that you're counting, you do not consider to be citizens or even human beings. Oh, congratulations. Right, great. Now, look, slaves had no right to vote. Obviously, they weren't considered people. That's not a good thing. That's a terrible thing. That's a terrible compromise. That's awful. And by the way, the reason it existed is because these southern states, slave states, wanted to keep these human beings as forced labor so they could exploit them for profit. It is greed and dehumanization at its most cruel and justified, of course, through massive racism. And contrary to this guy, this is the one that was talking was Jeremy Boring. He said that that the 3/5 compromise did help long-term to help slavery in the United States. No, it didn't. That didn't. No, that continued slavery. It did nothing of the kind. Again, you know what actually did help end slavery? The South getting its clock cleaned during the Civil War. That's what happened. That's how that worked. The southern slave states literally tried to leave the United States so they could continue with their horrible practice of human exploitation. That's what it is. And that's the reason that they even allowed slaves to be counted in the first place, because they were afraid of larger, more progressive states would outvote them. So they came up with this. And by the way, there were other compromises that were related to this, thanks again to the southern slave states, which meant the creation of the Senate. And it gets to where I believe the other guy was talking about, where it's like, oh, well, it's got no effect on today. I mean, it's got nothing to do with today. Oh, really? Really? What about the creation of the Senate? How about that? Where every state, no matter how many people were there, and again, this is one of the compromises they made. No matter what the population of the state, you got 2 senators to represent your state. Every state got the same. Do you know what the Senate, the function of the Senate is today? It's where legislation goes to die. That's where it goes. And so, look, conversations like this is why they want to ban any discussion of race in school. Why they want to ban critical race theory. And by the way, critical race theory, not in K through 12 education, but it's in college. But we've seen Republicans now go after critical race theory in college. And so, look, he said, there's nothing to do with today. No, it's extremely relevant. And here's some examples. Where did Build Back Better go to die? In the Senate. Where does voting rights go to die? In the Senate. Where is most of the power concentrated these days? It's concentrated in Republicans that represent small slave states that consistently will block good pieces of legislation that could help the majority of Americans, that's why it's relevant. It goes all the way back to the formation of our country and how our government, our bicameral house, where you have, or I'm sorry, our bicameral legislature, where you have the House that actually does have proportional representation, and then you have the Senate, which does not. And that set in the Senate is what gives these small states the ability to overrule the majority of the population when it comes to legislation. That's it. So yes, that's what they have. That's what they've done. They've created that system to give the minority who supported slavery all of this power, all of this power. That's why it's extremely relevant. The 3/5 compromise, and by extension, all the rest, has concentrated power in the hands of a few regressive assholes who use it to hold the country back on so many different issues. That's why conservatives do not want us to know history or to learn about racism or slavery and how those decisions still impact us today. And by the way, getting back to something that somebody in the chat had said, wasn't it the Democrats who were the racists back in the day? The Democratic Party, yes, it was. They did a flip in the 60s during the civil rights. The Republicans then got all the racists, and the Democrats got all the abolitionists. That's why, of course, you had Lincoln was a Republican. Also, really important to know your history, right? Because Republicans today are like, oh, see, we were the party of Lincoln. Party, but not ideology, because you had an ideology flip. And so, no, it was, again, the Democrats that were the conservatives back in the day. And the Republicans were actually the liberals. And so that's important context that people need to know. Now, of course, the current Republican Party wants to prevent people from learning about these things so that they can mislead people and say, no, we're actually not the party of racism. No, we're not the party of racism. And by the way, you don't need to know about racism. It doesn't exist. So not really important at all. And has no effect on today. Not true at all. Not true at all. And so this is a great mask off moment, even though I guess maybe they weren't even wearing the masks. But this is just an absolute, praising of systemic racism and a rewrite of history. Jeremy Buring, you're both a gross person and a racist.